In this workbook called Scoping, we've got a list in columns A and B. And you can see every 6 rows, we got the name of a different person and information about that person. Now, this is based on a real-life situation, but let's expand a little bit and talk about the idea of how we think out a macro. Here's what we'd like to be able to do. As we're scrolling through this list, we're saying this is all valuable information. But in order to work with it proficiently in Excel, it's going to be a lot better if we can turn this into a table-like list. Now, I've done this ahead of time, and off to the right, I made column C quite a bit wider for the moment. I'm going to click and drag the CD boundary there and pull it over here. And this is what we'd like to see eventually. So all this information here. So for example, here's information about Maria Alvarez, and she's early in the alphabet, and we see that alphabetized list over there. We see this over here in row 5. She works for Cameron Baker Residential Brokerage, and so on as we slide across right here. Same information, but obviously transposed. And let's say for Excel users, a list like this is a lot easier to work with than the list that we're seeing over in columns A and B. Now, this is the first time you've gotten this list. These are realtors in Colorado, and you work for a consortium of realtors, let's say in the Western United States. And as it turns out, you're going to get an updated list like this every month. And as it so happens, we also have another list for Arizona and California coming up. We don't have it just yet. And just based on population, you know, those are going to be larger. Particularly California, it's likely to be 7 times as large as this. When you are working with lists like this, by the way, not a bad idea if you haven't seen it before. Click on a cell, double-click the bottom edge. Excel will move downward until it sees an empty cell. And in this case, we can see clearly, this goes down to row 2400. So dividing that by 6, since we have 6 rows for each person here, we've got 400 realtors here. Now, again, think of this idea. We're going to be getting this list every month. We'll be getting it from other states as well. And from time to time, of course, the lists will grow. Occasionally, they might shrink. We want to be able to quickly turn this data into a list like what we see over here. So how would you do this? And there certainly are different approaches. One person might say the following. What I would do first is have this macro sort the data. So clicking in column A somewhere, perhaps, we could go to the Data tab. Let's see what this might look like. Clicking on the AZ button, it looks like this. Now, is that going to be helpful? Well, it could be. In other words, we could copy all that data, maybe put it over into column E, and then we've got other data below that, city, state, zip. That's certainly an approach. Keep in mind, the number of records that we're looking at could vary. And so that's a thought that might interfere with something that looks maybe initially kind of neat and tidy. I'm going to undo that with Control Z. Now, another person approaching this might say, I think it would be better if we instituted a filter. So we could click in here anywhere. There's the filter button on the Data tab. Click that. And what might we do here? Click Name here, and then come down here, unselect all, choose Name, click OK. Now we've got all the names. So we could probably copy paste those, for example, off to the right into column D. Initially, it would be empty. That's another approach. Could that be better? Well, maybe. And again, would we know immediately how to pick up all the records? Well, yeah, it looks like we could, because this would only be showing name, and we don't care how many of them are there. And when you copy data from a filtered list, it doesn't pick up the hidden information. So this is possibly a good approach as well. Now, a third approach is a little different, and it could be based on some ideas that you saw in previous movies in this course. Let's remove the filter. What if we were to turn on the macro recorder and copy the information about Sheldon Shellberg here over into column D, and then the business into column E, this into column F, and so on? Is there a way we could do this a little bit faster by copying and transposing? Yes, there is. But if we turned on the macro recorder and did this for 3 or 4 sets of names, that might reveal something as well. Now, I'm going to take the latter of the 3 approaches. I'm not necessarily saying it's the definitive way to do this, but I think it's better in the sense that it will reveal more about VBA and how you might want to work with it. Remember, this is a list that can vary in size tremendously. It could be 7 times as big as this. It might be a lot smaller. If this were the Wyoming list, that's about 1/10 of the population of Colorado these days, so it's going to be quite smaller. But regardless of the size of the list, if we have the same general structure here, we want to be able to get to this information. By the way, in the real-life example that this was based on, there weren't always 6 rows. In other words, for some people, there were more because in older days, you might have had fax numbers. Those are still around, of course. And there might have been more information about the addressing, maybe an additional line and so on. So in this example here, there are 6 rows about every person. So that makes it slightly easier as we approach it. So anytime you're thinking out a macro, you want to sit down and consider different approaches and perhaps experiment with it. Recognize too, if you're a little bit nervous about destroying data, make a copy of the sheet, make a copy of the workbook, in fact. There are different approaches there for security reasons. Experiment a bit. Let's say that we're going to take the approach here that we will copy and paste some records from column B over into columns D, E, F, etc. to the right. We'll do that for a few records. And hopefully the macro code that we will have recorded will repeat. And then we can make some changes to it and use some of the structures that you might have seen in the previous chapter regarding for loops and do loops. So always think out the macro first. On longer macros, you might think your data is unique and there's no easy way to get to this, but the techniques we will be using in subsequent movies will reveal a lot about how we work with macros and VBA in Excel.